bring you Dr. Nadia Brown. Dr. Brown is a professor of government and women and gender studies and Africana studies at Georgetown University. She's the author of one book and the editor of 3 more, as well as many important articles on issues related to race and gender, specifically Black womanhood in U.S. politics. She's also the recipient of a National Science Foundation grant on sexual harassment in the discipline of political science, along with her co-authors, of over $1 million. So today she's going to talk to us about her talk, Post-Kamala, Black Feminist Consciousness and the Emotions of Black Women in the 2024 election. We are so excited to welcome her here, and I hope you can be an attentive audience for you, Dr. Nadia Brown.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much to Grace's Hosts and the Department of Women's and Gender Sexuality Studies for hosting me. This is such an honor, particularly to be able to share my research during Black History Month, to talk a little bit about how Black women are feeling, thinking, and moving through processing the 2024 election. So this is also some new data. I've not presented this or shared this elsewhere. So I've been actually interested in your comments and your feedback. So I'm really looking forward to questions and hopefully bring some really good ideas to move forward. This is a project that is co-authored with Professors Camille Burge at Villanova and Christine Slaughter at Boston University. All right, so by now, I'm sure that many of you have already seen the vote breakdown of how this election went in November, and that Black women voted in 92% for Kamala Harris. That is a very large percentage of how one particular demographic group has voted. So as you can see in comparison to other demographic groups, like for example, the other largest demographic group of going for one particular candidate is white men at 60% for Donald Trump. But still, right, not as overwhelmingly as one direction as we see for Black women. And so you might have seen these t-shirts or sayings, bumper stickers, memes, phrases of like, the 92% did our part. Like, y'all don't come complaining to us when you don't like how this administration is handling things. Ask some of the other people. And so this is set to be an emotive response to how Black women felt after seeing the election results, but primarily because they showed up and turned out for Kamala Harris in such large ways. And so at Howard University on November 6th, Kamala Harris gave a concession speech in where she spoke about the role of women and young people, queer folks that are marginalized as having to be ever vigilant, right? Because issues such as bodily autonomy, issues of school and school safety, issues about gun violence, all of these things are impacting every one of us, right? Not just those that voted for Trump or voted for her, but as a society, these are things that Americans are going to have to deal with in this next 4 years. And she really urged Americans to ensure that they do so in a way that respects laws, that respects and upholds the rights of individuals. But in this speech, she also said that the fight has to happen, right? Fight happened in the voting booth. We didn't win. But there's a public square. We have to remember that sometimes the fight takes a while, and it doesn't mean that we won't win. And this was a line in the speech that generated a lot of applause. So it was this recognition that there has to be, sometimes you lose a fight, sometimes you might win a fight, but you don't give up, right? You stay in to fight the battle. And this is what she said at this point. So this leads us to kind of like the theoretical framework about how my colleagues and I are thinking through how to understand why Black women feel this way about being part of this 92%, part of the, they done messed around and now they found of this is like, so what does that mean for Black women? What is the way that Black women are making sense of this? So we're drawing from Black feminist consciousness, which is a theoretical framework that says that Black women who see themselves and understand themselves as facing unique discrimination because of racism, sexism, classism, and other forms of societal ills, see themselves as a group, right? See themselves as part of a collective. And you see a long list of scholars who've done this work. But it's not just having, right, this level of consciousness, this understanding of yourself as a part of a group, but it's that group cohesion leads to shared experiences that lead to political activism. So once you see yourself as part of a group that has dealt with some forms of marginalization, then you want to do something about that, and that leads to group cohesion. These shared experiences would then lead to political activism. And so members who see themselves as part of a group, in turn, should see themselves as moving to some sort of political action. So the puzzle here is, so then what gets people to participate politically? And this black box that we hear in political science in particular, people talking around but not really talking to, is how do you feel about politics? Do you feel angry? Do you feel sad? Do you feel fearful? Do you feel enthusiastic or energized? But feelings are just that, right? They're usually personal things that you feel, that you think about, that doesn't necessarily spur to any form of political action. But writ large, right, what we know about how feelings might lead to political action are largely focused on white Americans. And this body of research really pushes us to think about two forms of emotions. They are fear and they are anger. But they work differently for other groups, so we just know the most about that for white Americans. So the literature says, right, that if you're feeling fearful, you're not going to participate in politics, right? Like you just kind of like give up, throw your hands up. There's nothing really that you can do. And that has been linked to apathy in politics. But anger in politics, particularly for white men, has said that they're going to get out and do something. They're going to be politically motivated to change. But what does it look like if you look at a society that does not recognize fear or anger as a legitimate emotional response because of legacies of enslavement, legacies of patriarchy, right? And so what happens when you are members of the group that is oftentimes targeted as someone else should be fearful of, or that someone else should be angry about? And so this gives us a very limited notion about how anger and fear works for basically non-white men. So that's the first puzzle. The second puzzle are these three things here. So when we look at emotions that are associated with group membership, they tend to happen in one or three ways. So the research on Black women citizens and how that impacts their politics is often tied to shame. So this is coming out of Melissa Harry's work about Black women feeling shameful about either their economic status, their sexuality, their orientation to politics has led them to then feel like they are having to kind of like make these apologies for who they are, how they enter the world, and how the world sees them, and try to overcompensate with that. And part of that is dealt with a very personal feeling of shame and guilt. And so we ask, what about these other emotions, right? Like shame isn't something that you walk around talking about, right? Like you're like, oh, I feel so shameful. That's not happening, right? But people all the time hear politics saying, well, if you're angry, you're going to get up and do something. Or if you're fearful about, let's say, something taken out of the news, immigrants will take your job, right? This leads you to act. But shame is something that you tend to keep to yourself and doesn't necessarily lead into political action. The next thing that my co-authors and I are intervening on is that most of this literature on politics and emotion is heavily centered on survey data. So it's asking people to kind of check a box about what you feel. And checking a box about how you feel doesn't necessarily tell people how you feel. I mean, if you've ever been in an emotive state, you typically want to talk through that with someone who would understand and listen, right? And then maybe you say that you might feel angry, but when you talk it out more, it might actually be sadness. It might be fear, right? You can just think about the range of emotions that you might feel about a political situation or any situation that you might be in. And the more that you have a chance to kind of debrief and talk through it, the target emotion that you said might not actually be, really what's doing the work there. But then furthermore, even though we're critiquing, asking people's feelings on surveys, we know that those surveys are asked in a flawed way itself, right? And so usually, respondents are asked about emotions tied to a direct, either a person, like a political candidate, like, are you happy that Barack Obama was the first Black president? Are you sad that, Dobbs' decision was handed down and there's been more access to protections of abortion? They're specific targets. And so people can feel different things about these political targets, but they're only on those targets, not about a political phenomenon writ large that might be more complex than just saying, how do you feel about a political candidate? Or how do you feel about one particular policy? Most times, those things are intertwined, right? And so whether it's a politician that put forth the policy, whether it's a policy that politicians are running on, right? It's really hard to kind of dismantle and kind of disaggregate those. And so for those reasons, right, my co-PIs and I think that the work that we're doing by talking to people and by asking people a larger range to just, tell us how you're feeling, why you're feeling this way, gets us to a better understanding of what's actually going on. So in order to do this research, we conducted focus groups last fall through October 1st through November 25th. We had about 30 Black women participants. We did one repeat group right after the election. We did, November 25th, we did the repeat group November 25th. And most of the women aged range from 23 to 76 years old. Interestingly, right, I'm gonna call this a Democratic sample. We didn't ask people about how they are registered to vote, but no one self-identified as a Republican. But the things that they kind of talked about of the orientation led us to believe that many of them were either fully Democrats or they were independents. There was just no one who outed themselves as saying, like, I'm a Republican. Even when they espoused very conservative views, it was in the tone of, I believe this. Like, for example, we had a participant who was really adamant about being pro-life, but it didn't change the fact that she was still happy to vote for Kamala Harris, although she herself was deeply pro-life, right? So in a larger part of the study, we talk about another chapter, the ideology shifts, right? Kind of how people are making sense of the world in ways that are much bigger and broader and theoretically richer than just liberal or conservative, or Republicans or Democrats. The majority of the women in our studies, and you'll see me identify them as such, came from the Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic, and the Southeast. It's important to note that the majority, well, everyone in the study is college educated, and they were civically engaged. And so, like, they responded to do a focus group about the elections, so that you're probably a political science nerd, right? Like, this is something that you're not perhaps just your average Joe Schmo, right? You're someone who's, like, highly interested and wants to talk to academics about your research. And then lastly, I include this picture of me, my co-author, and the national president of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, which all three of us are members of, because we recruited heavily through our networks. And another scholarship that I've done and with another scholarship shows that Black women, Black men, those that are engaged in fraternal or sorority organizations are part of, like, the civil rights organizations 2.0. Like, these are these organizations that are committed to Black uplift and through, like, obviously these very gendered spaces, whether like this sorority like mine, but they are predicated on political engagement and awareness and civic education, right? And so it kind of maps on to the demographic groups of being college educated women, but they were also recruited through these own networks, right? So it's a tilted, or not saying tilted, but I want just to be really clear on the biases that are people that are in this sample, right? So it's not, that we don't have like many working class women in our sample. There are women who are working or were low income, but they were not ranked above working class socioeconomic status. All right, so I apologize to those in the back who might not be able to see this well, but this is a word cloud of, we asked the participants of the focus groups to describe how Black women feel after the election. And what they said basically was they felt betrayed, right? Disappointed, disrespected. They felt sad. Some felt resigned, hurt. And these were words that I think we probably would have expected, right? Given that the whole framework around we are the 92%, y'all done messed around and found out, I feel hurt right now, go away, leave me alone, I feel betrayed, you didn't show up for me the way that that Black women have showed up in other spaces. And this, right, just makes sense, right, in a lot of intuitive ways. But what did not make sense, or what like more of a puzzle, is we asked them, how do they feel before the election? And the terms that they used, like, they felt like Black women were discriminated against. They felt really anxious about the election. They were stressed, they were angry, they were really mystified. It felt like a black box of like what was going to happen. And the level, again, like of stress, frustration, and feeling heavily discriminated against is not something that most of what mainstream media was kind of talking about how Black women felt around the election, right? We wanted to hear kind of the same tropes around Obama with like the optimism, the hope, the change, right? All of the great things about the opportunities to elect the first multiracial Black woman president. It wasn't here before the election, right? And so this gets us at this, I think a really interesting point for us as social scientists to step back and move away from some of these cues of thinking, yes, because one group has voted at 92% for a candidate, this must mean that they were overjoyed about the opportunity to vote for one of their own, right? Kamala Harris, again, is a graduate of Howard University, historically Black college and university, is a member of an historically Black sorority, right? So all of these women that share so many things in common with Kamala, you would have thought we would have saw the excitement that was around the Obama election. It just wasn't there. So, and what comes next, I have the next couple of slides are quotes that I've pulled from the focus groups that aid in thinking about, I'll give you the context, and the aids in thinking about how Black women are processing what happened and what was going to happen. And the qualitative nature of the conversation, you'll see here in the words, but I'll explain to you kind of like how the conversations are coming out. So these are not quotes that are taken outside of a context of a conversation. And so the rationale of doing the focus groups, like how I mentioned earlier about talking about emotions, is that sometimes people don't realize what they're thinking about in articulate ways or how they're feeling in isolation. So having a focus group and talking to people in one room, you're able to play off of one another, right? So the context of these quotes might be related to one person saying one thing, but it's in a larger conversation about how the group was feeling. So this is the first quote from a millennial Black woman in the Northeast. And she says, "I think my major, which was political science, and then joining Delta, which is a sorority, really helped me kind of understand the importance and the history of Black people and women being able to vote in this country. And it really pushed me. And even now, like I just asked her mom is an immigrant, they're Haitian immigrants. She asked her what her voting plan was. And she was like, I don't even know if I'm registered. And I was like, girl, what are you doing? Right? So it's a work in progress. And so what this woman is saying is that thinking about Black women as being these saviors, right, was one of the tropes that came out after the 2016 election, was that Black women were saviors of democracy, and they were voting upwards of 90% for Democratic candidates. But not all Black women, right? Clearly this woman who is a naturalized citizen, her mother was a naturalized citizen, eligible to vote, could have voted, didn't even know that was she registered, right? And so part of the conversation in this focus group, it wasn't that Black women were excited to save democracy, right? It wasn't that Black women were excited to get out there and do this work. Some didn't even know, right, what was happening, right? So kind of, again, it shifts the narrative of its head that Black women are just eager to get out and support Democratic candidates. Not every Black woman is. And the second quote is from a Gen X woman in the Southeast focus group. And she said, "There's a lot of people, I feel like, who have this political neutrality, and that's a luxury that's not always afforded to everyone. I feel like my experiences have always been tied to knowing states of oppression. I want to continue the legacy that's been started by not only Black women in my family, but the Black community writ large." And so this is in some ways kind of opposite to the first quote. In that kind of conversation, Black women were saying, I don't have the opportunity to be politically neutral, right? Like the stakes are dire for me and my community. I've learned that from my family, and then seeing this in my community, that I have to get out and be politically engaged. not a luxury that I can sit by. And this really echoes into some of the more like canonical Black feminist texts that we have from like the Kabahi River Collective or Audre Lorde, right, who are really saying that politics is a must, right, to sit on the sidelines while others seek to paint the policy priorities for your community without talking about that isn't something that marginalized groups can actually do. And then this last quote is from the focus groups in the Northeast, and this woman says, "My mom had us in line with her to vote." And so, yeah, I think that's coming up for me. It's just, no matter what socioeconomic status I find myself, in or around, Black women have always, in my experience, been at the forefront of advocating for change and making sure that people are educated and participating. Mm. And so this is an example of kind of this conversation that we had in the Southeast, right, of that you just have to do it, right? Whether it's you're dragging your kids, your neighbors' kids to the bowling booth because somebody can't get off of work to do this, right? Civic engagement is just part of life, and that Black women have always done this. And so part of this conversation was talking about the spaces in which Black women have done this, whether that's in community organizations, in civic groups, through church or religious institutions, that regardless of their socioeconomic status, their relationship to the state, whether they were welfare recipients or they were making a lot of money, that this was just something that they saw Black women doing in their community, and this is what they were just carrying with them. And so for those women in this part of the conversation in the focus groups, they were saying, this is just what I know, right? Like, Black women just do these things. So then when we asked about how Black women felt about Kamala Harris's candidacy, I think this is what, as a researcher, this is one of the, I don't think the reflection I want to use. This is one of the most kind of like rewarding as a scholar, but also like, right, as a person kind of conversations. It's like hearing the ways in which Kamala Harris, just the discrepancies in which people had all sorts of views, right, about her. And again, wasn't covered in media about how Black women are feeling about it. Okay, so this is from the Mid-Atlantic focus group, and again, we circled back to this group for the post-election, so you'll hear more about them later. But one of the baby boomers in this group said, "I feel energized when she speaks. I mean, even though I feel that a lot of questions that are directed to her, she is still not answered, but I feel optimistic. I felt really happy after, and she early voted. I felt relief." And so here, right, in the same breath, right, this woman is saying, I was excited to vote for her, right, I felt relief, it was done, I did it, but I still have concerns, right? I don't think Kamala Harris is answering questions, she's not direct, I feel like I don't know her, but it was mostly, I knew that I wasn't going to vote for Trump, and I was relieved that I did my civic duty, and I did this, but, I don't really know about so much about her. Gen X, and then a lot of other women kind of chimed in on this, and they started to talk about Tim Walz in some really interesting ways. About, like, Tim Walz was the one who brought joy to the campaign, and I was like, oh, that's really interesting, how people were kind of perceiving this. But it was directed to, like, Kamala Harris hasn't done herself much favors of introducing herself to the public, which is so interesting, right? Because this woman was, the vice president, so we've seen her for 4 years. In fact, that some people said they didn't know her, kind of mapped on to other things that we saw in the media. Okay, this second quote from a Gen X woman in the Southeast. She said, "I admire and aspire to be like Kamala one day because, like my temperament, it's not well, but I like the way that she handles herself through adversity." And so an ongoing part of that conversation in the Southeast focus group was that so many just bad things are being lobbed at Kamala Harris, right? Calling her a lot of things that were untrue, trying to pigeonhole her in ways that were, honestly very sexist and racist. And I won't repeat some of the things that were said and some of the memes that were circulating, and even billboards that were posted, particularly outside of the Atlanta region. Mm-hmm. And the conversation was that she handled herself with such dignity, right? Like, even in the face of some of these really nasty things coming her way, that she, did the Michelle Obama, when they go low, I went high, and Kamala didn't respond in a negative way. And so this quote about like, well, I admire that, wasn't actually as much about I admire Kamala as a person, as a candidate, but just the way in which she handled that adversity, which is something, right, that the focus group participants talked about she had to do, right? Could you imagine if Kamala, as a multi-ethnic Black woman, would have attacked and said some of the very nasty, like vitriolic things that were said to her, if she would have turned around and given it back, it wouldn't be well received in a country that is still, very steeped in patriarchal, sexist, homophobic norms, that she would have been, really thrown under the bus if she would have said these things. And so the fact that she was able to comport herself in a way that the participants in the focus group knew that basically she had to, but probably didn't want to, right? And so I'm sure that many of you in this room can imagine yourself in a situation or have been in a situation where someone has said something, you've overheard something, something's directed at you, and you knew that you had to keep your cool, and how difficult it is sometimes to keep your cool. And so that's the kind of conversation around her being admired in that space. And this last one, this last quote is something, this is the one that I was like, oh man, I wish I could I wanted to talk more about during the focus group. But a millennial from the Northeast says, I'm gonna let the aunties be excited again. And by aunties, meaning older Black women. Myself, I've learned that I'm now an auntie. I'm in that group now. Okay, I'm gonna let the aunties, I'm like, oh, okay. Because I'm gonna let the aunties be excited again. I know people want the first Black woman VP, Howard sorority, all the great stuff. But again, someone mentioned the lesser of two evils. At the end of the day, Black faces and high places aren't gonna save us. And when they're on that, weird sellout type of high, that's kind of how I feel about this whole thing. And she also went on to say, right, that something that has lived rent free in my head since this focus group is that we're American citizens are making a choice between, what person will be the next war criminal in chief, right? And that for so many people, the lesser of two evil argument just wasn't where it was, right? And so we saw that in the beginning of when Biden was the candidate, right? That Biden was really running full-heartedly on, I'm better than Trump. And Kamala Harris picked up a lot of that and then was added on with, right, the aunties being excited to have one of their own, Black face and a high face, but really wasn't addressing what was happening in Gaza, which we know that many young people, and not, a lot of people, not just young people, right, really were pushing her on, and she just did it, right? And we saw what happened at the end of the results, right, where, lost a lot of the swing states, particularly Michigan, because Arab Americans did not feel supported by this that administration. And so, so this conversation that we had in the focus group about Kamala and letting the aunties be excited and also two evils, it was like this messaging is completely fell flat. Which is one of the, and this was an earlier focus group, right? Which is one of the things that in hindsight, we might wonder, did her campaign, were they hearing this too, right? Or were they hearing from people who were talking about her in ways that on front value it looked like, well, I admire her, I aspire to be her, but it wasn't about her, right? It was about the way that she handled this one thing, right? It was like a different way that people were painting Kamala in a way that I think the campaign had missed out on understanding the complexities of how people were seeing her. So this last slide of focus groups is wholly from the post-mortem politics. Maybe I can come up with a better name for that. If you have one, feel free to share with me. These are all from the baby boomers. And just to be clear, this was a very feisty group of women who had all the opinions and all the thoughts. And so much so that they wanted to come back and do a follow-up, right? They literally called us and were like, you need to have us back. We have more thoughts. And so in my entirety of my career, I have never had a repeat focus group where the focus group participants called me and said like, I have things to say. So I guess it kind of, goes with, like, they're really excited. So let's put that there. All right, so one of the baby boomers says, okay, so it all turned out to me is that Kamala was like a freak show. But really, it's like when you go to the circus and you watch when they bring out the freaks and they look at it and then, ooh, okay, I saw that. Okay, I'm just gonna do what I'm gonna do anyway, but to me, that's how it turned out. Pure disrespect. Because she's a woman, because she was black, because she was Indian, she's a mixture of whatever it is. They don't want that. So they got their golden boy. It's terrible. But that's how I see it. I see it, right? Not her time. And so relating what happened, like all the energy around Kamala was that people were just curious, right? It was like the freak show, and they wanted to come and see the excitement, the giving of money, the celebrities turning out at the rallies. It was just all political theater. And what this baby boomer was saying is, she didn't understand it, right? But now at the postmortem, she was like, they just wanted to see what it was. They didn't actually have any intention of voting for her. They knew where they were voting for. They just wanted to see what it looked like. Excuse me. Another woman said, I just said my prayers. I said my affirmations every day for Kamala. And then I said, well, that's all I can do. But I think deep down inside, I felt that she wasn't gonna win because of that. And I was hurt because I really felt that, we're just a sad nation. And I thought about seriously leaving the country and going elsewhere. And so this woman, and the focus group at that point took a turn of women all feeling kind of sad for themselves and sad for the state of the country. And this was really pronounced for, my co-author and I, although we are, aunties, we are not these aunties. And they've lived through the civil rights movement, right? They've lived through some really harrowing times of regression, particularly in Black life, right? They're thinking about the Reagan years and these neoliberal policies that have gutted Black communities. They're thinking about, ending programs that were supposed to be equality or equalizing for Black Americans and women and queer immigrants, right? They're thinking about all of the heights of things that they had gained in the 1970s and 60s, and seeing that, right, being part of those protests and affecting change in the 1960s and early 1970s, and then living through some of the rollbacks, and then now turning around and saying, I feel really sad now. And so we turned to them and like, you feel sad now, right? Like, now is this? And they were saying, yeah, like they were seriously thinking about leaving the country. And that conversation went to like what places would take a visitor visa to allow you to stay. Like, these women had done research between November 5th and November 25th, and we had the focus group. We ended up publishing something else out of this conversation where they gave us a list of songs, and it's posted on goodauthority.org, and I can share that maybe, and you could pass it out. But they shared a playlist of things that they listened to give them hope in the 1960s and 70s, and even the 80s, right? And they were really concerned that our generation didn't have that same level of like protest music, of hopeful songs that spanned different genres of music. So they went from everything from like country to rock to neo soul. Well, it wasn't neo soul, but it was just soul. Sorry. Right, to R&B, blues. Like, there was just a genre of music that you could listen to protest songs and uplifting songs around community that they felt sad for us for not having it. And so they were like, basically, you guys need to have some revolutionary music to get you through this, whatever that might be. Okay, so this last one is a quote from a boomer who was one of the first women to call. And she said, I have no hope for right now. I honestly don't. I feel Trump and his people disrespected us. And in turn, we disrespected Biden. We disrespected the process. And then, so everybody feels like they can do whatever they want. And so, this woman was she was Biden all the way. And she recognized that there was a lot of flaws and things, but she did not like the process in which Biden was pushed out. And so she felt that without having a primary where Americans could have chosen Kamala as the Democratic nominee by not, as the head of the ticket, that the process was that holding to the spirit of the law wasn't the same as holding to the letter of the law, and that if Democrats weren't going to hold to the letter of the law, then why should anyone else respect the process? And so Donald Trump, they knew, was already going to come in and disrespect the law because they lived through, his presidency, his 45, and saw the ways that they felt the Trump administration had tried to usurp constitutional powers and the rule of law. But then the Democrats turned around and did it to their own. She was just really adamant. A lot of the conversation stemmed around what is the process. And this part was particularly interesting. Again, hearing this from boomers who had again lived through, who had pushed through and lived through like the civil rights movement. And what they saw was that having benevolence from whether it's their state government, local government, or federal government isn't going to cut mustard if there are still laws on the books, right, that say that segregation is legal. It's not going to cut mustard, right, if you can't marry the person that you love because of their race, right? Like there has to be a law that changes this, that works for everyone in the nation. And so they were really beholden to law. And what they felt was that the process has to be followed through. There has to be due process. And if there isn't that, then nothing good will come of it. And so this woman was really adamant about what the Democratic Party did to Joe Biden was a setup for others to continue to disrespect the process of law. So I'll leave you with this. And this is something that I've been flushing around in my head, and I haven't, this is probably like, I want to write this, but it might also kind of start off as a journaling piece and then move into something else. But I did a talk with historian Martha Jones, who is a Black women's historian, who wrote this book called Vanguard that tells the story about how Black women pushed for universal suffrage. And so how when we were all celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment in 2020, that was in 2020, that we didn't uncover or think about the stories of Black women and pushing for suffrage. But what they were pushing for wasn't suffrage for them, right? But it was universal suffrage, right? So how are all the ways in which people are disenfranchised, and that Black women as being doubly or triply marginalized were in a position to want to advocate to end all oppression. And so talking with Professor Jones, and she runs through the book kind of like case studies about, like, let me tell you about this woman and this woman, right? And they're women of history that we all know of, like I'm sure that all of you know, like Ida B. Wells Barnett, and you know Mary McLeod Bethune. But the stories in which Martha Jones goes into them in connection to the election, really, or this past election, really made me think. And so these are two models that I'm thinking through about how, in conjunction with what we saw in the focus groups and the historical analysis of what Black women were doing, might give us a roadmap forward. So just bear with me for a moment, right? It's kind of what I'm thinking through. So on one hand, right, you have Ida B. Wells, who very famously, right, will, stands up for injustice, will curse anybody out, dare you to your face, and then see you in court about it, right? She wins, she takes zero shit from anyone, right? She argues with, W.E.B. Du Bois and walks away from the Niagara Convention, and that later on goes to form the NAACP. She argues with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and walks in the Women's Suffrage March in her own club that she formed because they wouldn't allow Black women in there, right? She sues the state of Tennessee after being thrown off of a train car because she purchased a ladies' train car, a ticket for the ladies' train, ladies' car, and the conductor says, well, like, Black women aren't ladies, you gotta get off. But she literally tussles with the conductor, and they're fighting when the police roll up, right? And she's indignant because the conductor has torn her dress, and she's like, oh, I'm a lady, right? I mean, and she sues and she wins, right? She calls out lynching as an unequal practice of talking about white women's virginity as at the hands of Black men, but not thinking about the ways in which Black women are routinely brutalized and raped, but that's not a crime. And she writes these like, she owns her own newspaper, and then when that newspaper gets burned to the ground, she continues writing in other places, right? Like, she, like, gives zero fucks, right? I don't know other way to put that. And I love this for her, right? And she has, I mean, there's, in the archives, there's so many, letters to American presidents that she writes, like, you're wrong, I'll tell you why you're wrong, right? And she's 100% correct. So she's like, for me, like the face of the opposition. Like, she puts her whole life into the resistance in smart ways, in some things, right? But I think in other ways, pretty dangerous. And I probably, don't have the spirit to do a lot of the things that Ida B. Wells did. But then on the other hand, right, we have Mary McLeod Bethune, who's also part of the resistance, but does so in a different way, right? So she forms Bethune College in Daytona Beach, Florida, that later merges with Cookman College. Bethune is an all-girls college, and in Florida, Jim Crow era, and she's trying to register Black men in the community in Daytona to vote. And the Klan rides on her college and burns it down, right? And burns down parts of, but not the whole college, burns down parts of the college. And so she's faced with a decision, right? Do something that she really, really believes in, which is registering people to, again, only Black men. Registering Black men to vote, talking about political rights, or keeping these girls safe, that she is, principal, she's the, president, principal of the school, and, people have sent their daughters to Bethune, to her college, and she has a moral responsibility, right, to these girls that are under her care, at the college, and she decides to walk away, right? She doesn't go back, she doesn't register people to vote, and it lays there, right? That is a decision, like a political calculus, to say something that I know should happen, that is legally their right under the 15th Amendment, but because of the Klan and racial terrorism, it's not safe for me to go back and do this work, right? So she makes the decision to live to another day. How hard, like, do you think that must have been? Right, she then comes to Washington, D.C., and she's part of Roosevelt's kitchen cabinet of advising the president and his wife on race issues. But as a woman, right, she's held to the back, but all of the men, the Black men that she's advising, part of Roosevelt's kitchen cabinet, look up to her, respect her, right? They are seeing her in this, verified auntie role. But she's also negotiating with the men about, like, the sexism, and she's also pushing back to the president on these racist issues. And she's talking to, in the letters you see in the archives between her and Eleanor Roosevelt, you have like a very deep and loving friendship, but she's calling Eleanor out, right? Like, she's holding no punches, but she's doing so in a way that's behind the scenes. And so I'm just thinking through, like, what we're getting in this post-election period are historical ways in which Black women have held true to their convictions and their beliefs, have just done so in different tactics in different spaces. And, and what we get from their archive, their letters, their other communications, and from biographies, is that they felt fearful, they felt hopeful, they felt betrayed, they felt angry, but the ways that they could express them were prescribed because of racism and sexism in society, right? That wouldn't let Black women demonstrate their full range of humanity by showing their emotions. And so at the top of our focus groups, we asked the Black women to describe what word best describes Black women in general. And as you see, the biggest word that they said was resilient. It was capable, it was powerful, it was strong. The Black women were nurturing, that they were flexible. So even in the face of adversity, even like with those two other word clouds about feeling betrayal and discrimination, right? The way that they describe and see themselves is resilient, is powerful. Which then I think helps me to think through, or I would like to say, right, this is the spirit of Ida B. Wells Barnett, the spirit of Mary McLeod Bethune, right? Women who know that there's more work to do and that they are there to do it. So we'll end here, right? And so the larger, like, byline political science, calling this stuff out, right? The things that we know that we get from doing a gendered analysis and a deeply gendered and racialized analysis through an intersectional lens, is that we know that exit poll data does not reflect the complexity of how Black women are thinking about politics, thinking about their group membership, thinking about how they belong, when they belong, and how and what to do there. But also that Black women aren't a monolith. Yeah, they showed up at 92% to vote for Kamala Harris, but some of them did it holding their nose, right? And what we miss by just looking at exit poll is that ideological diversity among women voters. And we broke ours down in generation because that was, I think, a pretty clear story to tell about the life experiences that people have lived through that kind of helps to shape their worldview. And I'll end with processes matter. While the boomers talked the most about processes, the other focus groups talked about that as other members of focus groups, the millennials and Gen Xers talked about that as well. Some of it was an optimistic, hopeful about the process, and others were like, not so great. And then this last part is the hopeful part that I need for my soul to hold on to. So I'm gonna throw that out there because I don't think you can get up and do this work, whether it's as an academic or as an activist or as a student, if you don't have hope for the future, right? And so this recognition that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And so that's that part, it's a bookend to, well, this is a quote from MLK, right? This is a bookend to what Kamala Harris said on November 6th, which is like, we have to keep fighting. And sometimes you lose, but sometimes you win. So cautious optimism is a must. So I'm open again to discussion, questions. Feel free to contact me via email. But let me open it.
Thank you so much. We have some time left, so if anyone has questions for Dr. Brown, then or suggestions, then I'm sure she would be delighted. So questions?
Oh, it's here and then here.
Yeah, so earlier you spoke about Harris and essentially the fact that you felt like her campaign wasn't actually considering the complexity of the way that she was being perceived, which I think makes a lot of sense. So what do you think, like, a successful portrayal or understanding, or what differences do you think would have changed in her campaign had people acknowledged her, had they acknowledged the complexity of race and the way that people understood her? But then also, what would that have looked like? So how would she have been able to, like, accurately appeal to people's understanding of the complexity of race and gender, especially for Black women?
So there's two things there, right? I think that and I've written about this, throughout her career, she's never talked about her identity. In a way that's tied to politics. She's talked about her identity as shaping her worldview, right? Like how her upbringing has helped her to see the world in a particular way. But she's always shied away from reporters asking directed questions as like, as the first Black woman, and to say to a general, how do you feel about X, Y, or Z, or like, as a candidate for this? She's always sidestepped that. And I think that might be up to history to figure out, was that a good move, or was that a beneficial move or not? I think that there are some parts where people want to hear that short, pithy answer. It's like, yes, as a Black woman, I feel this, right? Again, although she's talked about it and elsewhere, she's written books, right? It's not like it's a secret, but it just hasn't been answered with that framework. I think the harder part is, I think that the campaign thought that her race and gender would be shorthand for I'm like you, and therefore you will turn out to vote for me. The same way that Hillary Clinton ran the campaign of like, I'm a woman, you get the opportunity to cast your vote for the first woman president, without having the substance there too. So what does this mean to vote for a Black woman president? Like, that's the part that was like the disconnect. And I think by her not talking forthrightly about it, made people think that there was something to hide, or that she was trying to shy away from. And people didn't feel that one-on-one connection that politicians need to have so that they can feel that they want to vote for them, and they think that they're trustworthy. And I think that was a big part. The other part is I think they also just they didn't have people in the room who could say some of those things so that the campaign could have done some better work. So like, for example, so I was, like they could have had, So, okay, at the DNC, at the National Convention in Chicago this summer, there was some talk of Beyonce being there. And that was a rumor, didn't happen. But before that, there was talk of like, we need to have, like Rashida Tlaib or a Palestinian American address the crowd and talk about what's happening in Gaza. And instead, the administration or the campaign decided not to do that. And yet, and let's talk about like the celebrity effect of like the like, it was just a deep misunderstanding that people wanted connections with policy and not just the glitz and the glam, or not just the imagination of identity politics. And the campaign failed to meet people where they were, of like, I wanna rock with you, I don't want this guy, but I don't know where you stand on some things. And that part was never addressed, right? And I think that the ways in which the Harris campaign thought that they were addressing, it wasn't landing with everyday folks. And so like, yeah, if you're talking to a room full of like policy wonks, yes. But if you're talking to everyday people that don't know, like the OMB versus, right, the FDA versus the FHA, like, that means nothing to other people. I think there was that disconnect there. And they thought that, I'm gonna talk to you high policy and not talk to you about the things that make sense in your world. We're still gonna win, and it just didn't happen. You have a question here, somewhere? Yeah.
Yeah, so when you did your like post-mortem analysis of what people were saying, I'm curious, so the boomers have this historical perspective, they've lived through previous eras that are, if not similar, at least have parallels. But what did the millennials and the Gen Xers say, having probably grown up in households with boomers or with people who had that experience?
Yeah, I mean, so they were, so their experiences, or their examples didn't go back as far as the boomers obviously, but they did talk about, like, my mom or like my grandma, like, told these stories and I understood the importance, and that's why they, you know, dragged us to the polls to vote, and so I just grew up understanding that. And it was more of like, cultural traditions or customs as opposed to, I really, really understand. And then some of it was also like, I understand and I disagree, which was, you know, which was interesting because like the veneration of thinking about the civil rights era was